Hello Loomers. This video is comparing and contrasting different stockinette stitches on a double loom. There are multiple ways to do it and they all have their own little quirks, and I wanted you to be able to see what they were. So we're going to start with the narrowest stitch. It's called a box stitch. Now this is 8 pegs across, and you see how much it tightens up. And if you pull it, it's in groups of 2. And if we do it with a twisted stitch, it's a little bit wider and you can stretch it more. This, of course, is a straight stitch. So I'm going to start out with the straight stitch, which is the narrowest one. Come to the top peg 1, knit over to the next peg at the top, knit over, come to the third peg on the bottom, knit over, then the fourth. And you skip these 2 pegs up here, and then skip these 2 pegs down here. And you go like that across the board, 2 and 2. Then once you get to the end, you go to the top, do those 2 pegs, and then pick up these that you skipped, and then pick up these, and it brings us back to the beginning. Now, as you can see, if you're doing stripes, your stripes will not be straight across. They go up and down depending on which pass you are knit on. And if you do vertical stripes, they can only be 2 pegs wide. They cannot be 1 peg wide. But I think it's really great for doing checkerboards because it separates them out from the other color. Now let's do that same stitch in the twisted stitch, which is what you see up here. It's a little bit wider and floppier, but it can be easier for people to do. So here we go. You knit the whole row before you wrap the whole row before you knit over. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. All the way across, and we come to the top here and go back. And then we knit them all over. And you don't have to restrict yourself to just 2 pegs across. That's just the smallest you can do. You could do 3, 4, 5, 6. Heck, sometimes I'll do the whole row and make it almost like it's knitting in the round. And I mix that with other knits that actually connect the front and the back. Basically, it's a very versatile stitch, so you can mix it with other things to create lots of fun effects. And it creates these tubes. It's also called a tube stitch for that reason. And you can stick your finger all the way in those tubes. They run all the way down the length. Okay, so that's the box stitch. Now we move on to the classic stockinette stitch. It's the next tightest stitch from the box. And this is the twisted stitch version. It's not as tight as the straight stitch, but it's still tighter than the ones we're going to do next. So let's show you the basic classic stockinette. At the top, and you skip every other peg across the border as you make it down on your first pass. And then you pick up the empty pegs on the way back. And you make sure you don't have a knot in your yarn first. And there we go. So like the box stitch, this ends up at the same side of the loom that you started on. And because it has two passes, it does the same thing the box stitch does, in that half of the stitches will look a little bit higher than the other half, depending on the pass. So as you see in our stockinette, the horizontal stripes create that little chevron pattern. But the style of knitting causes the knits to face up and down, so our vertical stripes are nice and straight. Now when we twist the stitch, it looks a little wiggly, but not nearly as bad as on the zigzag. So next we're going to show you the twisted stitch stockinette. Start off in the same peg, but do little E-wraps. Skipping every other peg, just like before. We get to the last peg, come up to the top, twist the stitch, and go all the way back. And we knit over. Again, this is my favorite, the straight version is my favorite to use for vertical stripes. In fact, right here is a nice, clean looking example. Okay, now that we did the classic stockinette, both versions, let's move along to the zigzag stitch. As you can see, it's wider than the stockinette, and the stitches zig and zag back and forth each row. But Your horizontal stripes are straight. There's no chevron pattern in the colors. So this is a good stitch to use if you want to use horizontal stripes. Whereas the vertical stripes look really wiggly. So here we go with the zigzag stitch. Unlike the first two, you start at one end and you end at the other, doing every single peg back and forth. And then we knit over that row. And then for the next row for the zigzag, we again do every single peg. Now this looks similar, I guess, to a stitch people do called the fashion stitch. But the fashion stitch uses a slip stitch at the beginning and end of at the beginning of each row. We're going to be showing that after we finish doing the stockinettes. Now the zigzag has the straight stitch and also the twisted stitch. You see up here, the zigzag is much more pronounced when you use the twisted stitch, and a lot of people like that. It creates a lot of texture, and so let's show how to do that. We just do each and every peg in a row, making them look like the figure eight across the board. And then we knit over. And even though they look like figure eights, this is not what is normally referred to as the figure eight stitch, because that, like the fashion stitch, also has a slip stitch at the beginning. Whereas this one knits every single peg. As you see in our second row, and then we come down here and knit the first peg. Yeah, we're twisting this stitch, aren't we? Let's start over. Twist. All the way across. And then let's knit that over. Okay, now that we've done all the basic stockinette stitches, let's do ourselves a half stockinette. Otherwise known as the figure 8 and the fashion stitch. What makes these special and a half stockinette, not a full stockinette, is when you stretch them out, you see the pearls in between. They go from a stockinette to a rib stitch. And that is because we slip the first stitch every row. Okay, let's do the fashion stitch first. We're not going to knit this peg. Knit every other peg all the way across, skipping that first one. And then we knit over. So you don't have to knit this one over because we did not knit it, did not wrap it. Now for the second row of the fashion stitch, again, we do not wrap the first peg, we just skip it. And we follow the same trail back. So you shouldn't see any crosses of the yarn in this stitch. We don't have to knit this one over because we did not wrap it. So that was the fashion stitch. This one right here, everything is nice and straight. Also, if you look, if you want to do horizontal stripes, they are mostly straight, but on the ends, it goes down a little bit. Right there. But everything else is straight across. Now we move on to the figure 8 stitch. As you see, it's a lot bulkier, has a lot more texture, because of course we twist the stitch. Now we do not wrap this one. We just go across. Getting figure eights across the board. Following the same pattern of stitches as the row before, so there's no crossing of the pattern. Okay, so that row gets knit over. But we do not knit over this one because we did not wrap it. And the reason it is called a half stockinette, I said, is because when you stretch it out, you could see the purls. Also, there's a way for me to show you on the board why it's technically not a stockinette. Okay, so let's say I'm doing a stockinette. I do the first pass, and then there's supposed to be a second pass where I fill in all those pegs. That creates that cross. See how they cross each other? Well, let's say I only do the first pass. And that's all I do. I just reknit that same thing over and over. That would do the same, have the same effect as this. It would just be a little looser and wider because you're only doing the first half of the stockinette and leaving out that second half. Okay, so now I did all of the ones with thick yarn. The next ones I'm going to show require a thinner yarn because it's doubled up. So hold on a second. Okay, magically I'm cast on for the next stitch. It is a splinted stitch that I like to call the Nubby knit because I thought it up for my friend Nubby. And as you see, it is not the tightest, but it's not terribly loose. The horizontal stripes are perfectly straight. The vertical stripes are perfectly vertical. The stitches are straight up and down and straight across. Now, if you twist the stitch, it's not so nice. It's much wider and floppier. But with a straight stitch, I really like it. So here's how we do it. It starts out looking just like a zigzag, where you wrap every single peg all the way down from one end to the other. But instead of knitting over, you go back knitting every single peg. And this creates this pattern where you see a little figure eight thing, but you also see the diamond pattern that you see in a normal stockinette. And each peg has 2 wraps on it. Then you knit over. And the stitch is splinted and held straight because you see the diamond pattern on each side and held straight across. So even though you're doing a zigzag stitch, it doesn't zig or zag. Oh, come on, come over. There Another great thing about this is that you can use a size 4 yarn on a big gauge loom like this without having to use 2 skeins. Because you wrap each peg twice with the same strand of yarn. And again, that is what it looks like. And it's awesome for doing geometric designs and not having to use 2 skeins of yarn. And there we go. Those are all the basic stockinettes and half stockinettes. Oh, sorry, I lied. There's a box stitch that I splint a very similar way. I can't do it with a straight stitch because I don't have the right kind of loom. That requires a kiss loom, and I am not yet an owner of a kiss loom. So we're just going to do the E-wrap method, where we do the box stitch that we did before. And then we come up here, we wrap the top peg, and then come down to the second bottom peg, leave these 2, so we're filling in the gaps that we left. This gap here, we're going to fill that in. This gap here, fill that in. This gap here. At the end 2 pegs, and then fill in the rest of the gaps. See, the problem with a normal box stitch is that when you pull it apart, it creates those seams that you may not want. So this version avoids that, and it creates a nice little pretty pattern across the board. And that is my modified box stitch. And I think that's it now. All right. You have a good looming day. Bye-bye.